I can start whenever, but I'm happy to wait as folks drift in.
Yeah, just a few minutes. We can enter more people that we invite for the conversation. We have some how to call it? How do you will call it, Cesar?
College?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, there are some academics here of National University of Mexico. They will come together to be like part of the audience.
Great, that sounds fun.
So, Negrete, do you want to explain us a little bit of our invite today? Or maybe no.
Yeah, yes. And él es profesor de religión en el William College. Recientemente es muy conocido por
No estamos escuchando, camarada.
Oh, no me están escuchando. ¿Ahora?
Ya.
Su nuevo libro, que salió el año pasado, ha sido alabado por el nuevo sistema filosófico que ha propuesto. Igualmente, libros anteriores como The Myth of the Judgment o La invención de la religión en Japón han sido muy bien recibidos por la academia. Y hoy lo invitamos para que nos hable sobre su nuevo sistema filosófico que hace llamar Metamodernismo. Y igualmente hablar un poco sobre qué tiene que ver esto con la teoría de la religión, que veo que, por lo menos yo observé, que tiene muchas influencias del budismo y sobre todo de la teología del proceso de North Whitehead. So, how are you doing, Professor?
Good, muy bueno. Gracias por invitarme. Por favor, discúlpeme por mi pobre español. My Spanish is very, very rusty, so I'm just gonna be speaking in English, but I'll emphasize some things maybe in Spanish a little bit, and I gather there's translation going on in another channel. But it's a real pleasure to be able to speak before you and for your community. I'm really psyched to talk to you all. Yeah, thank you. And ignore the background noise. My daughter is playing in the next room, and she's a little bit chaotic, but that's what's going on.
So we can start with the questions, Cesar, or we will wait for your partners.
I have my partner is here, but the other one we're having like a little bit troubles with him, so he will be with us in like 10 minutes. Then I have a friend who's managing that part, so we can start with questions. Let me translate the questions to start this this evening. So Mr. Storm, in your book you said you didn't want to propose an ism, but your book is called Metamodernism. Why do you have this problem with the isms? It's like a problem with the postmodernism itself, or what's happening there?
Yeah, great. Well, I'll try not to talk too quickly, so forgive me. But so I dislike isms. Often seem kind of inflated, often ideological, and so I have a slight dislike of isms, kind of by default. And it felt kind of hubristic to try and create my own ism, but on the other hand, the project didn't fit into any existing movements, so there wasn't any ism out there that I felt I could legitimately join. And when I sent it out for review, for peer review, the peer reviewers referred to it as postmodernism, and that made me want to throw up. Like they seemed to want an ism, but the ism they wanted, they were trying to apply to it, was just one of the worst. So I felt that I needed to find some kind of ism because I was going to be given that kind of a title anyway. And so I was looking around, and I remembered, I was thinking and looking around it, and I remembered some work that I had read by a Nigerian art historian named Moyo Okadiji, who described metamodern artists who were trying to extend and challenge both modernism and postmodernism at the same time. And that language of metamodern as a way to transcend modernism and postmodernism was very appealing to me because in many distinct respects, that's what I was trying to do with the book. So to try and say that, just to underscore it in my poor Spanish, maybe this isn't useful, but honestamente no me gustan los ismos, pero los lectores académicos parecen necesitarlos. Si un ismo es necesario, debe señalar una postura trascendente tanto hacia el modernismo como hacia el postmodernismo. If that makes sense. I'm trying to transcend both and work through both. And so for that reason, I like the word metamodernism, if I'm going to be weighed down by an ism anyway, at least. And in that, I especially like the meta. The emphasis should be on the meta. And I should say, this is before Mark Zuckerberg created his silly branding of Meta, which I don't like and think is terrible, but that's a negative coincidence. But the idea of Meta as something that goes beyond or transcends, in this case, both modernism and postmodernism, seemed to capture what I was trying to do with the project as a whole. Hopefully that's clear.
Thank you very much. Next question. So we have this metamodernism.
Let me.
Okay.
I have a question. A question this specific of
Okay,
mine.
okay.
A question of mine here. Okay, you're doing a little bit like Descartes when he speaks about God, like in La Duda Metódica, no? The method of doubt. I guess it's translated is like an academic. An academic branding kind of, no? Kind of marketing intro into the academic. Am I understanding it right?
I would say it's there is a little bit of branding, but it's more that academic scholars seem to really want to push people into boxes and categories. And the only way to resist, it seemed to me, I first thought that I could resist by just refusing all the categories, but then I thought, but it wasn't working. So if I'm going to get assimilated to some group or another, I might as well use this word metamodernism, because otherwise people were going to stick me back in with people that I really disagreed with. So, but it is, a little bit of self-conscious branding, you could say. I don't want to go too far with that because, I use that as a kind of play, but I don't think of my enterprise as capitalist. So insofar as it's branding, I'm not trying to sell books. My publisher would like me to sell books, but honestly, my books are available whether or not you buy them in certain places online, let's say. And so for that reason, I'm just trying to get ideas out there. And for that reason, but to get it published, people were just going to call it an ism anyway. So at least I might as well own it rather than flee from isms. And then if I was going to pick an ism, the meta prefix did some good work for me. Yeah.
That's really cool to hear. I'm glad to hear it. So we are gonna go with the next question, Negrete. You can now. Sorry for the interruption.
Las preguntas las voy a decir en español para que todo el mundo las pueda entender.
Okay, sure.
En grandes rasgos, ¿en qué consiste el metamodernismo?
So metamodernism, as I articulate it, is a revolutionary new paradigm for the human sciences. It is an attempt to do kind of systematic philosophy, and it emerges by working through 5 problematics associated with postmodernism, questions of realism, skepticism, the value of value, the nature of the social world, and even the meaning of meaning. So to put this, to try in Spanish to say this, en grandes rasgos, el metamodernismo es un nuevo paradigma revolucionario para las ciencias humanas. Sigue trabajando a través de 5 problemáticas asociadas con el postmodernismo. Las cuestiones del realismo, el escepticismo, el valor de valor, el mundo social y el significado del significado. En otras palabras, el metamodernismo es una solución a los problemas de la crítica que no abandona la crítica, if that makes sense. But it's an attempt to produce a new systematic philosophy. It starts kind of working its way out from postmodernism, but then it ends at a point that should stand on its own. So even if you don't care anything about postmodernism, it seems terribly old hat to you, or even if you don't care about the terms modernism and postmodernism, it's an attempt to argue for a new paradigm for how we might do work in the human sciences, humanities and social sciences, how we might think of the social world in a new way, how we might understand language, particularly the nature of meaning itself, and so on. So for that reason, that's what I'm trying to do with anyway, systematic philosophy. And that emerges from kind of dialectically working through these 5 problematics that are associated with postmodernism in philosophy. So not postmodernism as a time period, but postmodernism as a paradigm that for a while was really dominant in a lot of humanities and social science disciplines. Yeah.
Thanks. So there are previous authors that already developed this idea of postmodernism, but nadie se había atrevido a sistematizarlo. La mayoría de las corrientes, de los libros que se habían publicado, those books doesn't have a systematic thinking. Why did you see? ¿Por qué viste necesario escribir una teoría sistemática del metamodernismo?
Yeah, totally. Great question. So, I mean, there are other authors who've used the term metamodernism, and mostly what they're trying to do, you're exactly right, is they're not doing systematic work. They're inspirational and useful in certain ways, but most of them are trying to describe various culture forms that they call metamodern. And that's really, they're trying to decide, is there a new kind of post-ironic so-called structure of feeling, or is Buffy the Vampire Slayer doing something different than high works of postmodernism or something like that? Some of that stuff is great, but it's definitely not what I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to describe a pre-existing metamodernism, but I'm trying to produce one. And in order to do that, I had to do some important theoretical work. And the reason, to take a step back, the reason I felt the need to create a new theory is because of the theoretical training that I had as a graduate student and as a scholar. So, postmodernism, which started as a critique of dominant paradigms, had itself become the dominant paradigm when I started graduate school. And I was trained to deconstruct, basically. I was trained only to deconstruct. And I wasn't just like a little bit into this. I was super into this. I went to Stanford because Richard Rorty was at Stanford, and René Girard. I went to Paris. I went to Germany. I saw lectures by Derrida, by Latour, by a whole bunch of other people who were associated with postmodernism, and I loved it. I marinated in it. I liked the power of the critique. But there was a problem with it too that became clear to me the farther I got in graduate school, and especially after graduate school, as I became an established scholar myself. I got sick of the way that we were only taught to deconstruct. We were taught how to take anything and hurl it into the abyss, basically. We were masters of suspicion. We could call out anything as problematic. All of that is good. I like calling out. I think it's vitally important politically, philosophically, etc., to call out injustice, to call out bad thinking, to critically deconstruct our categories. But the problem is everything was always terminating only in the negative. This was a philosophy that always said philosophy itself is impossible, and I began to feel like it had become a dead end. The only thing we could do was tear shit down, but we could no longer build. Una filosofía solo negativa, right? It was just this negative philosophy, and so when I was trying to actually do scholarly work, like think about how the world might be put together, I realized that I needed to move beyond postmodernism. It had become a kind of dead end, a kind of blind alley. Postmodernism also had started on the left. It had started with an emancipatory profile, but even by the time I was in graduate school, it now had come to function significantly on the right. And so whatever postmodernism had promised us as a kind of emancipatory critical theory had run aground. And in part, postmodernism failed politically for a whole bunch of reasons as a kind of emancipatory theory. And so, it had given certain people great careers or what have you, but that seemed shallow and cheap. And if we wanted to, it had started, talking truth to power, or trying to question the powers that be, but it ended up just questioning itself and questioning literature, and left power in place pretty much the way that it had been. And so now it was already clear in graduate school that postmodernism had weaknesses, and there were other people trying to think of different ways out, but most of them were actually trying to lead us back towards something that amounted to modernism. They were trying to slap the table and talk about objectivity and realism or something like that in some grand tone, or lead us back to an enlightenment that they invented basically as a kind of a mythic enlightenment or what have you, or they thought you could just merely substitute politics for all your academic scholarship, as though if you just had all the correct political conclusions, you didn't need to do serious study of any kind of subject matter. And all of these, many of these things were well-intentioned, but I think that they failed insofar as they failed to take seriously the real problems that postmodernism introduced. Postmodernism's problematics were real. Were important. They were real forms of skepticism that were valuable, and they couldn't just be leaped over into some idealized form of realism, nor could they be subverted merely by ignoring the nature of the world for the purposes of particular political projects. So what I wanted to do, what I got into the academy for, was I wanted to make a positive change and do a kind of productive difference in the world around me. And postmodernism, it seemed to be a dead end. So I started looking for something else. And then I have this problem, which is that I feel like a lot of theory is basically bullshit. A lot of it is stuff that just sounds really cool, and that comes to bother me. And so, and in particular, I wanted to be consistent. A lot of things, if you read them, a lot of works of high theory, if you push into them in a lot of detail and you think hard about them, a lot of them either turn out to be trivial or self-contradictory or poetically inspirational. But that's it. I mean, not to knock poetry. I love poetry, but but you can't only have poetry. And so I decided that I needed to come up with something to address these problems. And every time I would try to address one problem, it would affect some other area. So if I thought about how to deal with the problem of realism, that pushed me into the questions of knowledge. If I thought about questions of skepticism, that pushed me into questions of value for various reasons. And so trying to take that seriously and systematically meant that I ended up with something very new. In a way, I did it in perhaps the most unpromising way, which is that I ended up working through postmodernism by radicalizing it. So try that in Spanish, superar el postmodernismo radicalizándolo. So by radicalizing many of postmodernism's gestures, it actually, I was able to do a move that Hegel described, which is a negation of the negation, although, again, I don't want to name drop, so ignore that it comes from Hegel, but try and pivot our attitude toward these grand areas of concern. And out the other side of them, actually, there was a whole plethora of beneficial results, new things that we could do, new ways to think about the nature of society, new ways to think about knowledge, new ways to understand, processes, for instance, and other kinds of things, all by kind of working out from the discourses of postmodernism, by taking its problems seriously, but then not dead ending in them, starting from them and seeing if we could build on them. And so this is, I could be a Freudian about this or whatever. I'm trying to overcome the work of my parents' generation, and my parents' generation were the postmodernists. And so now we're in the next generation, and the question is, we could either try and ignore the problems that they successfully brought up, or we could try and consolidate some of them, work through them, and out the other side of them. So in certain respects, the book is more postmodern than postmodernism it was. All people have said that. But in other respects, it's really not, because it's trying to be self-consistent. It's trying not to be bullshit. And I'm really trying to take us in a way out the other side. So the book has a kind of dialectical structure where part of it guides you through deconstructive moves, but then out the other side for some kind of recuperative project. So that's, and I think it's really important because theorizing in the humanities and social sciences has in many places run aground. Basically, a lot of sociological theory has dead-ended. Anthropology is in the process of self-destructing in certain ways, and I love anthropology. I mean, these are disciplines I love and have a lot of passion for. The economists are kind of taking over, and economics is its own super capitalist, terrible discipline for the most part. They have pushed out all the non-orthodox economists and consolidated a particular terrible neoliberal orthodoxy or whatever. But in the humanities and social sciences across the board, I think we were floundering for a lack of good theoretical language that actually helped us accomplish the projects we wanted to, whether those projects were intellectual, epistemological, or political. And so for that reason, we needed something really new. And the way to get there was not to ignore the reasons that many of these disciplines got into trouble in the first place. I'm not trying to pretend that there was no colonial legacy or what have you, or to ignore baked in forms of inequality, etc., but actually to start from them and then figure out where do we go from here. So it starts from the negative but doesn't terminate in it. And for that reason, but I think it has a lot of payoff. And I'm already starting to see from friends and colleagues who are picking up pieces of the project the kind of work it can do in a whole range of different academic disciplines. Yeah. So sorry, that was a long response. I got a little sidetracked there, but good question. Thank you.
Well, long question, but a good one.
We were here to hear all that long questions. We like that. It's
okay, great.
It's amazing.
César, ¿quieres preguntar la siguiente cosa o yo la hago yo?
Hazla tú, pero déjala, también le meto una anterior antes de que vayas con la siguiente. Okay. So, Mr. Storm, I have a question. Sure. Another question of mine. Postmodernism, in an hermeneutic way, is proposed like generality, like a fails mode, and individuality, like a fails. Respect the generality. That's what postmodernism, in a didactic and hermeneutic way, are proposing. So, my question is, in metamodernism, what is individuality? Respect the generality.
Yeah, if I understand your question, I mean, I think what postmodernism was really good at doing was undercutting certain kinds of generalities and a hyper focus on in certain ways on the individual, on the exceptional, on the way that things were heterogeneous. It was, in the language of Deleuze, a philosophy of difference, right, or Derrida, depending on who you're interested in. And we got really good at showing how generalizations failed and placing an emphasis on a kind of hyper individual, and it paralleled a movement in economics and social sciences, not that thought of itself as postmodernism, but this kind of methodological individualism that tended to see the individual as the center of theorizing in social sciences and social theory. Against that, for metamodernism, as I propose it, we start to think of the social world not in terms of homogeneity, but actually in terms of heterogeneity. And so part of the way that postmodernism gained ground was by focusing on various kinds of exception, by focusing on various local forms of difference. But if you grant like the universality of difference, then that's that contradictory formulation, then you then start to be able to focus on the exception, and the exception turns out not to be difference, but actually moments of similarity. So to talk about it in terms of individuals, we can say that in certain ways, every individual has distinct uniqueness, but we are all often, but the ways that we are similar become things to explain. So, why do we all like, I don't know, David Bowie music or something, or whatever, and we don't all probably, but I do. Then we can tell a narrative story about why that similarity exists. So actually, it turns out that, that's a triviality, but we can think of many different kinds of ways in which we do come to share similarities. We don't actually exist as fully atomized individuals. And in terms of the hermeneutic dimension, a lot of postmodernism inherited from modernism and from thinkers like Descartes notions of an individual subject as looking out on the world. This was kind of the homunculus view of the rational subject. Postmodernism dropped the rational part, but basically still kept this homunculus. The idea that we're this little person in the brain that looks out on the world, and that Descartes thinks he can autonomously, thinking in his own head, reason his way back to the world, but he has to start from a form of skepticism that is radicalized down into the Cartesian I, the Cartesian subject, the cogito, the famous cogito ergo sum that he didn't exactly say, but people quote him to have said. Well, postmodernism also tried to treat an atomized individual, in which it was now the barrier between the individual and the world was supposed to be not just some kind of general skepticism about the senses, but actually language itself. This was or perception itself. This is what Heidegger called the hermeneutics, or the hermeneutics of being. And I wanted to start actually that premise, that whole idea that you presume that you're going to start your theorizing in a phenomenological way from the individual subject and then somehow find secure knowledge, fails to find secure knowledge, and that's why you lead towards certain kinds of postmodernist doubts. But it's also probably a bad starting place. Actually, we can start from that we just shift the burden of proof, and if we grant that we can never prove that whole bunches of things, that we're not in the matrix or what have you, we can be doubtful. We can say, okay, maybe I'm just a brain of out, or maybe not. But if we say, well, but insofar as I have any experience of the world at all, it seems to be a world in which there are other entities in it. And in fact, the only way to make sense of language, the only way to make sense of, there are no private languages. We're interacting or speaking or thinking in relationship with others. We don't presume that the world is as it appears. In other words, we don't take the realist modernist move where you of certain forms of common sense realism, where you say, yeah, it's just what it looks like. But you can start from presuming that there is a world out there to be experienced, and that world doesn't have to have any of the things we associate with it. It doesn't have to be the world exactly described by modern science. It doesn't have to be a whole bunch of other things, but just that it has to have just some minimal properties to it. There has to be a world. It has to be a little bit clumpy. Things have to stick together in certain ways. And if you grant that then it solves a whole bunch of other problems about the nature of knowledge, problems about the meaning, problems about the nature of language. And it reminds us that all this time that we were thinking of ourselves as autonomous individuals, we've been part of networks. Nobody is an island. I mean, nobody is fully and totally alone. All of our preferences are things that we emerge in interaction between ourselves and the world, or ourselves and other people, or ourselves and other sentient beings, etc., etc. And so for that reason, the attempt to reduce the individual to the isolated, atomized subject, whether skeptically or not, or to try and explain things in terms of methodological individualism, just doesn't work. And so for that reason, I think the other thing that came out of this whole kind of theorizing was the idea that problems could be solved at the individual level. So one thing that happened in, how did people try and fight climate change? Not by doing probably what they should have, which is large regulation of these heavily polluting companies, but by shifting the burden onto the individuals. I mean, it was literally, I think, the oil companies that encouraged this notion of individual carbon footprint to try and focus everything on individual choice. And that fails to solve that problem. Or to address issues of systematic racism, for example, a lot of companies invested a lot of effort in these really small attempts to weed out implicit bias. But that's all focusing on the level of individual, and these are actually structural issues that need structural kinds of solutions. And so for that reason as well, politically as well as, let's say, epistemologically, this notion of this atomization across these disciplines needs to be resisted. I hope I answered your question. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. So we keep moving forward. remember the previous acknowledgement, Professor? A little more slower so the translator can do his work, please. This is the next question. So, continuando con el discurso que planteaba respecto a la individualización de los sujetos, existe ahora mismo una perspectiva relativista, como bien lo mencionaba, y un poco también antiesencialista en el discurso político dominante. Por ejemplo, en algunas corrientes de la teoría de género o del decolonialismo. Pero lo que más le interesa a usted desmontar, al menos en el libro, es la idea de la muerte del arte o del concepto de la religión. Parece usted que pretende crear una teoría alternativa que explique estos dinamismos sociales por medio de una filosofía del proceso. ¿Qué ve de conveniente en la filosofía del proceso y en qué consiste?
Okay, great. Yeah, a lot of great issues there. So I came out of these schools of theory. I mean, my early work, my first book is basically post-colonial or decolonial theory, and I do a lot of reading in feminist theory and critical race theory. And I think that they generally have good politics, but they have not very good theories of the social world. And this is a problem because if you want to change the social world, you need a better theory about it. Si queremos cambiar el mundo primero, debemos entenderlo. So we need to. If we're gonna change the social world, we need to have a better theory about it. And how do I know it's a bad theory about it? For some of the reasons that the individualistic theory is dead-ending, but also even more importantly, so the problem with notions of anti-essentialism, which became dominant in feminist theory and critical race theory, etc., is that they didn't go far enough in a way. Anti-essentialism, the anti-prefix only describes a negation. So when feminist theory in the 1980s, for example, was very much focusing on just de-essentializing gender or being anti-essentialist on gender, it was unclear what the next step was. Once you've negated essentializing gender, what can you do beyond that? Or put differently, in terms of post or decolonial theory, once you have rightly called out the colonial forms of thought, the question becomes what to do next. And unfortunately, often these critical theories also preserve the very thing that they're trying to negate. So, post-colonial theory is full of quoting from colonial thinkers in various attempts to eliminate those thinkers, but it actually preserves them through the very act of negation. So I began to look to other sources for techniques to think through these grand categories these kinds of ways of thinking through things like race and gender, etc. And one of my home disciplines, as I was mentioned in the introduction, is religious studies. And my first book directly does a post-colonial critique of the category religion. But when I discovered from reading quite widely that there were a set of critiques of the category religion and religious studies, of society and sociology, of culture and anthropology, of politics and certain sections of political theory, of race and critical race theory, of gender in feminist theory, of art in philosophy of art, and so on, all of which shared similar patterns. Put differently, many of these categories were being deconstructed according to the same set of strategies. And for those of you who are curious, I have a whole chapter in the book where I try and provide a kind of deconstructive dojo. It's me being negative, but like I'm trying to summarize in a way what you would get out of graduate school, at least in the Anglo-American Academy, in a range of critical disciplines. And it just to teach you the techniques of knocking down and destroying categories like art and religion. Now, this is not to destroy art and religion, to be clear, but these were debates around the limitations of the concept of art and the concept of religion, or the category religion. For instance, already in the 1950s, a famous philosopher of art named Moritz Weitz, sorry, I'm going too quickly, I'll slow down, had already launched a very famous critique of the category art. Basically, he argued that any attempt to define art necessarily resulted in failure, because just as soon as you've defined art, somebody is going to come up with a new kind of art that precisely breaks that definition. And And then in particular, also followers of his in art history began to note that the fine arts and the way that they were drawn together had something to do with European colonialism, had to do with a particular Eurocentric conception of various diverse things that went together. Why is painting fine art as well as dance, as well as sculpture, and why are arts different than crafts, etc. So in that respect, he had provincialized the category of art. And in religious studies, we had done similar things with religion, and the same thing had been done in a host of other disciplines. But often people then terminated in the negative move. So once art had been disintegrated, a lot of people thought it wasn't a problem anymore, and they would, weren't interested in doing anything further. Or in religious studies in particular, we seem to be going back and forth about whether to deconstruct the category of religion or not endlessly, but mostly trying to reassert discredited definitions of religion on the sort of modernist side, or on the postmodernist side, merely deconstructing it again. And one of the inspirations behind the book was that if these categories could be deconstructed in the same way, that meant that they shared something very important. In other words, if everything from art to religion to politics and to race to culture can be deconstructed according to the same, whatever it is, 6 or 8 strategies, rather than thinking that means that you can't do any scholarship because everything can be deconstructed, actually, I think it tells us something fundamentally about the social world and how it is put together, or how sentient beings produce the world around them. And for that reason, if you grant all these critiques, instead of resisting them, if you say, yes, religion can be deconstructed in ways X, Y, or Z, that process of deconstruction starts to lead you to the emphasis on processes themselves. In other words, a lot of these critiques, and I'm really simplifying for reasons of time, a lot of these critiques turn out to be critiques of in misplaced concreteness or reification. The first is in the Whiteheadian vocabulary, the second is in the Marxist vocabulary, but a lot of them end up saying, for example, that we tend to treat the category of religion as if it's an essential thing, as if it's a thing, an object that does things, as if it has discrete boundaries, as if it tends to be the same over time. And there's even psychological evidence from research among among children predominantly, but in other areas as well, among American undergraduates at least, that there's a tendency to essentialize many of these categories and not realize that the categories are fuzzy, have rough edges. We tend to treat, many people in North America tend to treat race as an essence, for example, or what have you. And so that's an example of reification. And what I was reminded of was that people like Whitehead had in the process of formulating process thought, had done so precisely or thingification or misplaced concreteness. And so one of the first moves was to recognize that the social world is made up of processes. And that sounds it might seem obvious, but actually in a lot of academic disciplines, the processual nature of the social world was seen as an obstacle to further study. It was why, sociologists had said that because everything changes, you can't have a systematic social science, at least some critical sociologists, or, linguists had tracked language change as extremely fast, and in anthropology, the rapidity of cultural change, some people had said, precluded the study of culture, or they're trying to explain why things changed. And actually, I think although we could keep going through academic disciplines, economics had a mistaken notion of homeostasis as a kind of central feature of economic models, or what have you. And once we grant that things continue to change, that not only that, but, and I don't mean this process as a metaphor, I mean it in a very literal sense, the social world is weaved together out of processes, then that helps us understand the social world better, and understand how it works, how it is constructed, how it might be changed. And we might say, it gives us a new window on the social world. And the thing that many social theorists thought that they had to explain before, which was the nature of change, or why things like tradition change, were explaining the wrong thing. What they needed to explain was why there were any temporary zones of stability at all. And then that turned out to have to do with, and then I formulated a theory about how that works, basically. So to put it, to try and say a sentence of this in Spanish, maybe, let me, if I can think about it. La ontología social del proceso es necesaria. Es necesaria para comprender el mundo social, no solo de los humanos, sino de todos los especies sociales. In other words, I think that a process social ontology, and forget the jargon word ontology there, helps us understand not just human social worlds, but the social worlds produced by all kinds of creatures, any kind of social animal or creature. And so some people who've turned to process thought before have often, there's a great tradition of process thought in philosophy of science. There's a great tradition, starting with Whitehead. There's also significant currents of process thought in East Asian thought, which is where I got a lot of it, and South Asian thought. But process thought can be found in many different parts of the globe. There's even a recent case to be made that Nahuatl thought, the Azteca thought had a process component to it. And I think that's all important, but for the most part, those forms of process thinking had been applied merely to a kind of physical ontology. In other words, to the main material of metaphysics, of physics. And what I wanted to do was not to apply that kind of thinking to the social world instead of merely the physical world. To be clear, I'm interested in how the social world is itself materialized. So I'm not ignoring the materialized aspects of the social world, but I wanted to focus on it in terms of the processes. And if you do that, I think it gives you a new way to study the world. And so the other point I want to make is that insofar as there has been process thought in social theory among my crowd, for example, people like Bill Connolly, or American political North American political theorist who spent some time thinking about process thought, but what he gets out of process thought is mostly just flux. Just wants to say, okay, process thinking is important, but that means things could change at any time. That's not actually, he's not taking it far enough. If something's a process, we can study it, its phases, how it works, how it functions. And not only that, because things could change at any time, the fact that they don't becomes the problem to be solved. And so for that reason, it helps us with our reorientation, our attempt to de-anthropomorphize, perhaps, the humanistic disciplines and allow us, or maybe to reject anthropocentric versions of the humanistic disciplines, to see how humans are social creatures like other kinds of social animals. And in that respect, I think it helps with a kind of naturalized social science. But it's just better. It just makes better. There's better descriptions of the social world and what happens in it than other theoretical models, and it's a way of moving us out of and providing an alternative to either atomizing individualism or an older discredited kind of social organism or social holism, which tended to also reify things like nations or cultures as if they were self-contained units. So for all those reasons, and the biggest bulk of the book is me trying to figure out, in a no bullshit way, what would a process social science look like, and how would we do it? And so there's a big, long, dense set of chapters in the middle of the book where I try and provide more detail than probably most of your listeners need in trying to figure out what that would look like and how to make it not just be a metaphor, not just be a superficial gesture to processes, but thinking concretely. So I think that's why I shifted toward process thought. But mostly when in the book I'm focusing on a process social ontology rather than a process physical ontology. And so hopefully,
thank you very much. We need to keep moving forward. Sorry. So you are not the first author that wanna rescue this process philosophy como una manera de asociarlo a un nuevo paradigma en el que vivimos. Hay otros autores que igualmente lo están haciendo. Esta es una pregunta, a very personal question. Hay otros autores, por ejemplo, Alexander Barth, me pareció que es muy similar a las ideas que usted está más o menos desarrollando. Es un autor que también usa la filosofía del proceso, también es alguien especializado en estudios religiosos y además también es alguien que habla de un nuevo paradigma más allá del postmodernismo y el modernismo. Me pareció muy curioso que estas similitudes se encontraran y le quería preguntar si usted está familiarizado con este autor y sus ideas, Alexander Bard.
Yeah, I had never heard of Alexander Bard before before somebody mentioned it to me, and I think if I'd had the name in my head, it was as a musician, not as as a theorist. So I don't really know his work very well. I will say that there have been other attempts to do specifically process theology, especially after Alfred North Whitehead. And I know some of those a little bit better, and I'm sympathetic to them, but I'm very much not a theologian. I'm really much more, I see myself much more as a philosopher, so I'm not hostile to theological efforts. I'm not trying to reject theology. I'm not one of those crusading anti-theology folks. But I'm really, I'm trying to, but I'm not coming from a Christian background or from a Judeo-Christian background. And so I grew up with Buddhism, and the kind of Buddhism that I'm interested in doesn't tend to think of itself in theological terms, although we could argue about that. So I haven't been tracking as much attempts to put process theologies into play. I think basically because it just isn't central to my interests. I'm not trying to recuperate notions of either pantheism or deism or anything like that. I'm not a crusading atheist by any means, but it's not a central concern of mine. And so I think also in part, when I last checked in on many a certain subset of process theologians, what they were getting out of processes was also a notion of the miraculous, of a flux and unpredictability, the Heraclitean aspect of processes, and that's something that I'm just not invested in as a philosophical problem. I think for the same reasons that I think that if you lean too heavily into flux, then you're actually just going to tend to terminate in various forms of skepticism. Not to say that there isn't any flux, but that if you think that the main thing you're getting out of it is just, things could be otherwise and could change at any moment, that's not false. We don't know that things will continue the way that they are, but it seems to give too much weight toward that more skeptical position. But I don't know Alexander Bard, and I'll have to read or have to at least look at his work.
Yeah, I recommend it. Next question, moving forward.
Yeah.
Right now, estamos viviendo una época en donde se fetichizan los datos. Y en el discurso político actual, siempre se usan a los datos como entidades que hablan por sí mismas. Y me pareció interesante que rescatara la idea de la abducción como respuesta a estos tipos de discursos. ¿Por qué vio importante rescatar la idea de la abducción en el libro? ¿Y cuál fue la razón?
Yeah, good question. And we can talk. I'll talk about this, but I'll probably loop through some of my Zeteticism too. So let me try and get us there.
Nice.
So basically, it would seem that a lot of people have, as completely right, have fetishized notions of data or notions of knowledge. There's a whole crowd of people who for generation who want to thump things as if they were facts. I call them fact thumpers. I don't know if you saw this, but after the disastrous 2016 political election in the United States, people thought, we could have totally fixed things if we had just if the left had stated the facts as if there was some kind of uncontroversial notion of fact. And even the political campaign crew of the former presidential candidate Hillary Clinton, they would post these things that were basically like memes, but they were supposed to be fact memes. It would be 1 in 10 Americans is homeless, fact. But it would never tell you what the source was. It was really bad, and it actually contributed to skepticism. So I don't think that there are facts, clear, uninterpreted facts, and in fact, there are reasons to be skeptical of that project. But on the other hand, what many folks in the postmodern world were really into was a kind of skeptical dogmatism. In other words, one of the ways that postmodernism gained ground in the American Academy was by being skeptical of things, by saying things like there's no such thing as truth, or perhaps all knowledge is power, or there's nothing outside the text, etc., etc., etc. Now, you could note that none of these statements is itself actually really skeptical. It's not a doubt, it's a dogmatism. So if you say knowledge is power, you're not actually expressing a true skepticism. You're expressing a dogmatism, perhaps masquerading as a skepticism. And one of the things that I thought we could do in the book, and I'll get us to abduction in a minute, but the way to solve these skeptical problems is to be skeptical of skepticism. We can actually turn the doubts, turn the dogmas back into doubts. To try and put it in a different way, if you're skeptical, you can generalize skepticism. So I'll take a step back. One of the essential figures in the history of skepticism was a dude named Sextus Empiricus. And he described, he's one of the great Roman, classic Roman skeptics, and he described his own movement in terms of a critique of an older form of academic skepticism. So he said, basically, like, I'm trying to do this from memory, but they're these people who are terrible because they think they know everything. We can get rid of those because it's easy to introduce doubts. Then there's a second group of people who are sure that they don't know anything. These are what he called academic skeptics. These are the skeptics of what happened in Plato's Academy, basically. And then he said, but they seem to be strangely confident that they know nothing and that they can know nothing. The true skeptic is one who doubts whether he or she can know anything. So that kind of skepticism of skepticism is itself a new position. And so I took a name from that history of skepticism and called the skeptical of skepticism zeticism, which is to say this is a position that a kind of humble knowledge that comes from doubting doubt. So it is an attempt to resist doubt. It is an attempt to say, to try and go back to slapping facts, but it is a recognition that there are just as motivated reasons for promoting doubts as there are for promoting knowledge, or people slap facts just as some other people, promote doubts. And so, and skepticism can be turned on itself and become skeptical of itself. So it's not the case that I know nothing, but rather that I don't know what I actually know. And so out the other side of skepticism is a kind of humble knowledge that I call zeticism, a kind of humble knowledge, conocimiento humilde. And I think that the best way to produce humble knowledge is by abduction, by inference to the best explanation. And it's a particularly, it's a slant on abduction. The turn to abduction is perhaps the least novel part of the book, but you would be, for those of you who are in philosophy, abduction is associated centrally with Charles Sanders Peirce and the American pragmatists. It's a kind of pragmatic way of looking at the world that works in terms of inference to the best explanation. It's the way that it's the way that characters think in mystery novels, right? Like Sherlock Holmes, when he wants to figure out who murdered the man in the alleyway, he both accumulates evidence that contributes toward that conclusion, and he also accumulates evidence that would seem to refute the conclusion. And he's starting from a particular state of affairs and working backward to see what caused them. How did that guy get stabbed? Who was around? It couldn't be the butler because the butler was, in Spain or whatever. And so you then come to infer the best explanation for why the guy died, namely, I don't know, somebody murdered him and it was his wife or whatever. That's an abductive inference, or an inference to the best explanation. Now, to that, there are a number of contemporary proponents of abduction. Mostly they're in analytic philosophy departments or teaching criminal justice or in law schools. But many of them are overly confident at the end result of abductive inference. So they don't treat abduction as a way toward humble knowledge. They say, yeah, I could be wrong, I could be a little fallible, but they think that they're basically right. And into this, a postmodernist or someone who's experienced postmodernist skepticism can always continue to introduce new doubts. So part of the point of Zeteticism as a stance towards knowledge that is neither an emphasis on certainty nor an emphasis on dogmatic doubt is a notion that we can't always doubt. We don't know that if we will know, we'll never have the final word on things. Knowledge itself is a historical product of an unfolding processes. And so this goes back to my process ontology. And abduction is the one process through which we can gain knowledge, but that knowledge is itself fallible and it's time limited. It's not sub specie aeterni. It's not a kind of universal knowledge that will always be the case, but rather what we get is humble provisional knowledge. We get things that are approximately right, and we can never know for sure about the kinds of errors that we have. And the other thing I drew from the ancient skeptics was that they argued that we needed to be more careful when the stakes for the knowledge, for the subject at hand, are higher. So today, some people think, some analytic philosophers think of Bayesian inference as the model of human thinking, where you increase or decrease your doubts by 1 percentage point probabilistically based on new kinds of evidence. I don't think people think like that. I think that what people do is that they get more skeptical when it's really important not to be wrong, and they tend to get less skeptical when the stakes are low. Now, or they get less skeptical when they're attached to a kind of dogmatism that I think we can work to shed. But if the stakes of me being wrong, if somebody says, is it raining? How likely do you think it is if you're raining? I might have a guess, but my doubts don't go up. It's not a matter of serious concern for me, because it doesn't matter that much if it's raining right now. But if my how confident am I that it's not raining? I'm not that confident. But if my windows were rolled down, it would become very important for me to know for sure whether it was raining or not raining. And that would shape my orientation toward that knowledge. And even then, my sense of whether it's raining or not might be complicated. I don't think that we are, as ordinary humans, fully consistent in our thinking. I think we work hard at best to be consistent. So I might think maybe it's raining, maybe it's not raining, etc. And we can hold contradictory things in our head at once. I'm now going on a tangent. All that is, I think what's really important is an orientation. The way to diffuse skepticism is not by returning to positivist notions of knowledge, but you can diffuse skepticism by being skeptical of it, by actually being a truer skeptic. And for that, I call that a zetetic. And zeteticism then leads back toward a kind of humble knowledge. And that is really important, both in our political terms. We're constantly being bombarded with information. We're constantly being bombarded by people who fetishize quote unquote facts as if they lived in some decontextualized world. But we're also being bombarded by people who think that, there are alternative facts, that there's no such thing as truth. And so the response to both of those is a kind of skepticism that terminates in humble knowledge. And then the way to produce humble knowledge on the ground, if you're trying to be just a person in the world who's trying to figure out a problem or whatever, is by, I want to argue, by means of abduction and inference to the best explanation. And there's a little bit of work, it's very tentative, but that shows that those kind of inferential structures, while not ubiquitous, do exist cross-culturally. And there's even maybe a hint of evidence that there's some non-human primates, etc., use things like abductive inference as well. So I don't want to say most of us don't always think that way, but I think we can practice thinking abductively will help us produce the kind of humble knowledge that we need. And so I think I've answered both this question and the term on zeteticism as well.
The zeteticism position is a very well planted one, but autores previos del metamodernismo prefieren llamar a ese zeteticismo el paradigma post-irónico. Y pretende resolver el mismo problema. Y también se hacen llamar metamodernos, como bien dicen, ¿no? ¿Por qué decidió ignorar el término post-irónico para mejor llamarlo zeteticismo?
Yeah, I mean, so I don't think of it primarily in terms of irony. I think of irony as a kind of cultural affect rather than an epistemological stance. But I'm not even against, I don't know if I'm even post-ironic. I think I would say, you can be, irony often renders itself ironic. Let me put it in a different context. a number of the other people who, or some of the other folks who call themselves metamodernists, are anti-critique. They think that the basic problem is that we got critical, that we got ironic, and that the goal is to find a new feeling of sensitivity, of sincerity, and to abandon critique in favor of, aesthetical orientations toward our subject. I feel like, those people, some of them are friends of mine, that they're good folks, but I don't think that they're actually addressing the real problems. Inference is not information. Critique is actually, I'm pro-critique, but I think we need a critique that can also critique itself. So the idea is not that the problem is not that we're critical. Being critical is actually how we grow, how we also work toward a more just society, which is really important to me. We have to be able to call out injustice. We have to be able to have critical orientations to our subject matter. It's just that we can't end in it. And so it's the same thing in terms of my epistemology. The problem is not, its problem is not doubt. It's when we only terminate in doubt and don't work through doubts toward humble knowledge. And the same thing about irony. If you only are ironic, then you've got a problem. But if you're able to use irony to realize how, overly deploying irony is itself a defense mechanism and is its own way ironic, or more specifically, I'm not anti-irony, I just don't think everything needs to terminate in irony. So that's where we kind of part ways. And then the term zeticism, I mostly formulated not because not in parallel to post-irony, but in respect to this term of skepticism. So I originally was calling it skeptical skepticism or radical skepticism, but then people assumed that it was terminating in doubt. And so I was like, okay, can't call it that. And also, a lot of people who call themselves skeptics are actually just dogmatists about something or another. So in religious studies, when I see somebody and they call themselves a skeptic, it means that they decided they don't believe in religion at all. That's not the attitude that I want. It isn't I don't believe in religion. That's a very dogmatic assertion sometimes, for some of these, self-avowed skeptics, anybody who's going to announce it to the public world. And I also didn't like the word fallibilist because that tended to, although it was closer in some ways, but that tended to be basically a form of naive realism that just wants to assume it could be wrong, but it probably has everything figured out. And so that's why I turned to this ancient Greek term zeticism and tried to revive it. So it's a different stance. It's an attempt to not have an excess of beliefs. So, and to not... and not to presume certainty, but to continue doubting, but also to not give up on the possibility of knowledge, even though I can't know that I know. I can never be certain of my knowledge. And so, to loop us back to René Descartes, for example, who we've been circling in this the whole time, Descartes famously articulated a kind of doubt that's sometimes called Cartesian doubt. And he wanted to say anything that's not, I want anything that can be doubted, I doubt. And then he says, then I find things that are certain, and then I work my way out from certainty to certain knowledge. The goal of Descartes' doubt was to come out the other side, and he identified knowledge was that which was certain for him, basically. And he thought that was associated with mathematics, etc. Most of Descartes' project was not skepticism. It was this kind of what he thought of as certain mathematical knowledge of the world. Well, I think the problem was the equation of knowledge with certainty. Not that he doubted. Okay, Descartes could doubt. There are many reasons to doubt. Could the world I see in front of me be an illusion? Yeah, it totally could be. The problem is not that you doubt it, but that you assume that the only way to understand knowing things, the only way to represent knowledge, to have real knowledge, is to have certain knowledge. And because the thing is, certain knowledge doesn't work. It's impossible. Every knowledge can be doubted. There's no such thing as certain knowledge. So a lot of people post Descartes, have noted that they don't read what he thinks of as certain knowledge. Like, they think he's wrong about that stuff. So actually, his doubts have been more influential than his certainties. And it was a mistake by him to locate us on the philosophy on the path of certainty. A lot of other thinkers, his contemporary, for example, there's Francisco Sanchez was a contemporary of Descartes who emphasized humble knowledge. We would have been better off following that dude. Or, there are a lot of East Asian thinkers or South Asian thinkers or indigenous thinkers who in their very, very different repertoire associated knowledge with humility and with doubt. What's weird is the way that a particular kind of European philosophical project got equated with certainty, and then it had some good effects, but it also had some terrible ones. And I think certain knowledge is itself impossible. And so for that reason, I want to lean. The problem for me is not so much irony; it's either excessive certainty or a certain kind of skeptical dogmatism. Yeah.
Sí.
Ya casi arribamos al final. Solo son un par de preguntas. Otra cosa de la que desarrollas bastante es this term, los semiotics. Y habla sobre cómo hay una interpretación sesgada de las afirmaciones estructuralistas respecto al lenguaje, ¿no? Como ya bien lo mencionabas. Y ¿en qué consiste tu réplica a este escepticismo del lenguaje? ¿Y cómo sabemos que tu hipótesis escapa de una estructura ideológica previa?
Okay, great. So, yeah. Philosophy of language. Good. So one of the other big contributions to the book is I'm trying to promote a new philosophy of language as a response to structuralism and post-structuralism. And so one of the things that I argue is that basically Saussure, the founder of structuralist linguistics, provided a theory of language that it was at best incomplete and mostly just wrong. And Saussure famously argued for a differential account of meaning. He didn't exclusively argue for that, but that was his main theory of language. And much of post-structuralism is proof that that's a bad philosophy of language, that it doesn't work, that it is an error. How do we know? Like a lot of those guys, Derrida, Lyotard, etc., they argued for the impossibility of translation, often in works that most people read in translation. They argued that reference was impossible. They argued that meaning itself was impossible, even as they tried to stake out certain meanings. This notion of the differential account of the sign, for which Derrida's notion of différence is formulated for, or he argued for. So I'm getting too fast. Différence, that difference is only a problem if you believe Saussure was right about language. But it turns out Saussure's not right about language. Actually, all these count as evidence against Saussure's claim that meaning is primarily differential. So what I tried to do then, on the other side, in certain sectors of analytic philosophy, there was an idea that language was like, pretty much transparent to the world, at least scientific language was. So that there were certain things called natural kinds, and that the primary thing that language did was reference, that you didn't need meaning, all you needed was reference. And I wanted to argue against that too, because it produces its own kind of paradoxes that I won't talk through here, because I'm not assuming I'm talking to many analytic philosophers, but there are problems with Kripke, for instance, and what have you. So on the other side of that, I wanted to argue for a kind of so on the other side, so I think the postmodernists got right that we tend to interpret the world. But what they got wrong was the idea that we tended to interpret the world primarily with language as the intermediate category. And part of the evidence for this is that you can look at other kinds of social animals. And I had the inspiration moment for an alternative, actually, and this is very resonant in French. What's the word in Spanish? Anyway, with your community, because I saw actually this. It wasn't a bonobo, but it was a snow monkey in Japan, and it was clearly trying to communicate something to me. And struck by that, I started thinking about how language had evolved, how monkeys communicate with each other, and what I try to think about is, what if instead of theorizing meaning with humans at the center, we start from the animal world? And I came upon a particular Baltic German thinker named Jakob von Uexküll, who had done some theorizing to sort of start me off, but I ended up going somewhere else from it. But the thing about animals is that they don't experience a pure and unmediated world. The chimps have ways of interpreting the world. So do ticks have ways of interpreting the world that they encounter. But they encounter the world not through the intermediary of language, but through the intermediary of meaningfulness. So for a tick, for example, like, a little insect tick, it smells certain kinds of chemicals in the sweat and decides its actions depending on what it smells. It makes a decision about what it's encountered, and it categorizes beings into the category of things that are fun to suck on and things that are not good to suck on, etc., etc., etc. So it is, ticks are hermeneutic creatures. Monkeys are hermeneutic creatures. They interpret the world around them. They just aren't using language as a central mediary. So for language to evolve, it probably evolved on a stratum of world interpretation that was itself not linguistic. And there's evidence for this too, both in the history of human evolution, but also we have pre-linguistic interpretation of the world around us. My daughter, is seeing the world that she lives in and is trying to associate things with it even before she has words for those associations. So also, there was a presupposition that you could do philosophy of language without doing the world. So people Saussure bracketed off the world. They said, let's just ignore reference. Let's just only talk about the relationship that one sign has to another sign. Well, it turns out if you do that, then you never get the world back, basically. It actually doesn't make it, if you ban reference from the beginning, then there's a problem called the symbolic grounding problem in linguistics. But anyway, you end up not being able to have a theory of meaning. It keeps running into Derridian problems. So you have to have reference as part of it, but you don't have to have a particular world. The world doesn't have to be, monkeys don't have the scientific paradigm in their head, right? They just see a world and they see certain aspects of it that seem meaningful to them. And so for that reason, I decided to try and articulate a semiotics located in the world. And I did this in conversation with my brother, who's actually an animal studies specialist, and helped me with some of the animal behavior studies that I would have otherwise missed. And we called this hylosemiotics, which is to say materialized semiotics. And hylosemiotics is a kind of naturalized semiotics, which theorizes animals at the center. And what comes out of that is this idea that what is meaning is located, a meaningful sign emerges from a sentient being and its environment and the interaction between the two things. So when I look out at the sky and I say, oh, the clouds are gray, I think that means it's going to rain, that is a more primary notion of meaning than linguistic meaning. It means it's going to rain, or it means it's probably going to rain. But also, unlike some other folks who think in terms of natural information, I think of this in terms of inference. So I'm seeing certain parts about abductive inference, actually, but I'm seeing certain parts about the cloud, and I'm inferring from them that it is going to rain. That means I can be wrong about what the cloud means, but it also means that different people, different entities, can look at the same cloud and infer something else. So a monkey looking at that cloud might not infer that it's going to rain. A monkey might look at that cloud and infer from the way that the cloud is coming through that the trees are going to turn their leaves over, or something like that. So it's the same tree, but people are making different kinds of inferences, or people, and different humans could make different inferences from the same cloud. Right? So that is to say, meaning emerges in a kind of perceptive way. There's an asymmetry between sender meaning and receiver meaning. Receiver meaning, what I'm consuming in the world, is inference. It's hermeneutic, it's interpreted, but what a sign means is what a given sentient being infers in a given context. But on the other hand, now, there is also sender meaning, and sender meaning is what someone who's producing a sign wants the other person to infer. So when I say, I'm Professor Storm, I want you to infer that I prefer to be called Professor Storm. You all don't need to call me that. You can just call me Jason or whatever. But or whatever. That's an inference I'm hoping that you will have. And it's also important that the unit of meaning is materialized signs, not words. So it's not, words don't live in some weird void or space. They have to have sound echoes or sound vibrations to get to your ears, or they have to be written on a text, etc. And inference is not absolute, but it's interpreter relative. So you might infer different things. And in that respect, I'm always communicating more than I mean to communicate voluntarily. So there's no single meaning. Even though, as I said, I have a sender meaning, meaning I'm trying to communicate, that's not the only thing ever that I am communicating. Like, I might also be communicating inadvertently by my accent what part of North America I'm from. I'm not trying to communicate that, but I am. Or I might be inadvertently, if I were drunk, I would be inadvertently communicating the sign, the meaning to certain viewers or listeners that I was drunk, or what have you. So the same way that a text communicates more than what the author puts into it. But anyway, that's a tangent. So all that is to say, the world is mediated by meaningfulness. It is hermeneutic, but it is not mediated only by language per se. like other living creatures, we're hermeneutic beings, but our perception is not limited solely by spoken language. Spoken language might shape and color aspects of how we see the world, but it isn't the only thing that our previous experiences, our inferential background, etc. There are a whole bunch of other things going on beyond just language that shape how we see the world. And so in that respect, we're not, as Heidegger thought we were, like exiled away from being, imprisoned in language, but rather we, like the other creatures in this world, and like the world itself in a certain way, are constantly interpreting it and interpreting the world. So in that respect, we live in a constant world where I'm interpreting the monkey and the monkey's interpreting me. The trees are interpreting the sun, etc. So at least all living creatures, all sentient beings are sign consumers in that respect. And that's what I call hylosemiotics. And then I have a long ass chapter that probably needed to be trimmed. It was the last chapter I wrote, so it's appropriate we're ending our summaries here. But I hope that you'll read more details in that. Yeah.
So last question, so we can pass to the chat questions.
Yeah.
Es muy bien conocido, it's very well known that in the United States the post-structuralist and the structuralist ideas son dominantes en la academia, y tanto como profesores como alumnos suelen estar muy comprometidos con la ideología progresista basada precisely on structuralist philosophy. And, como bien menciona usted, suele ser una interpretación incorrecta de las ideas, ¿no? Es de esperarse cierta reacción por parte de la academia, y le quería preguntar, ¿cómo ha recibido la academia su trabajo y cómo ve el desenvolvimiento de las ideas metamodernas?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that structuralism and post-structuralism are heavily embedded or assimilated in the American academy, especially in like most of the academic disciplines except linguistics itself. So, insofar as both of those are philosophies of language, it's incredibly ironic that the people who study language for a living have long since jettisoned those. I mean, that's based on Saussure's work more than 100 years ago. And it's true that the people got into post-structuralism and structuralism because they thought that they had a certain kind of emancipatory progressive politics, but because of this idea that language is cordoned off from the world, that reference is impossible, that language is itself super powerful and important, then people keep trying to change things only at the level of language. So there's a huge invested energy that comes from post-structuralism in policing people's vocabulary. They're committed to a sort of ideological, fetishization of language and fixing problems only at the level of language. If we just get the right words, then we will solve the problem. And I think so. I'm not trying to say that we should, be using hate speech. Don't mistake me for this, but I'm saying it's not enough, and it's not even the right place to put our efforts is policing language, especially because you get a synonym treadmill, for example, going, irrespective of the failed philosophy of language, but even as politics it fails. So, for instance, people used to call there used to be a medical category called idiot, which meant somebody who was developmentally challenged, and that then became, when that was the correct word, but then that became substituted with mentally retarded, but then that became a politically incorrect term, and then it became developmentally challenged, and then that became the politically incorrect term, and then it became cognitively neurologically atypical or whatever. That's just going to become another term that people will then want to police. I mean, there's a never-ending thing, and it doesn't necessarily improve people's lives. Again, I'm not telling you to be assholes and use bad words for people, but I'm just saying it doesn't solve the problems of most of the people who are being so categorized if you just treat the words as bad words and get rid of them. It's like, if we could solve racism only by eliminating certain words from our vocabulary, that's not enough. That's not even the best place to focus our energies or efforts. So in that respect, I think I both have a better philosophy of language, and by focusing on language's materialization and how it fits into a whole larger social ontology or social world, I think I have a better case for how we might tackle and work through systematic problems in ways that recognize the importance of language, but don't terminate everything in language. Again, that recognize we can't just solve everything at the level of changing our vocabulary. And in fact, like, we're just wasting way too much effort policing people's vocabularies. And in fact, I have a theory about why we do it in the book, because it's part of how social kinds are policed, and category membership is policed is by shibboleths, by words that people use that fit them into different groups and others. But let's bracket that out for a second. I'm, very progressive myself, and, and I totally agree with emancipatory politics. It's just that an emancipatory politics can't terminate in language, and we need to spend less time policing people's mistaken expressions and more time, making it harder for cops to kill people, or, focus on prison reform and a whole bunch of other really concrete things. So you also asked how the response has been, and actually, people have actually been really positive. I've been really delighted. Not to say that everybody has, but I think there've been 8 or 9 published reviews of the book so far. All but one of them have been, were very positive in one way or another. They always have one thing or another that they want to argue with me about. No academic ever has written a review and didn't put something critical in it. But I've been really delighted at the response. I've also been getting really nice emails, especially from graduate students. And junior faculty, especially people in, precarious positions or non-stable positions, a lot of whom like the tonal shift from not merely being critique, but being critique and then working past it. I've gotten emails from people who are social scientists who want to use some of the categories seriously. And I've even gotten emails from people doing, at least one person doing computational linguistics who wants to use my high-low semiotics as a new way to think about language processing for computers. Not my specialty. I hope it'll work, but I don't know if I've helped them. But I have gotten negative emails primarily from established folks who we might call postmodernists. And they're from that older generation, mostly people in their 60s and 70s, and some of them are incredibly critical, and they're critical because they think, but it's not mostly at the level of language, and they don't tend to read the book very closely. So I find it very frustrating. They're basically like, I got an email from a Derrida scholar who's like, nothing comes after Derrida. You haven't really dealt with the real Derrida enough, or whatever. And I'm not in the Derrida business. I don't think Derrida is the only figure relevant to the study of postmodernism. So, but anyway, except for a couple pushbacks like that, I've been really delighted at the positive response, and I've been especially thrilled that I also got emails from non-academics. I got an email from a labor rights lawyer who's using this work. I've gotten emails from artists, a tattoo artist who finds it inspirational, the whole thing. So, I mean, more so than I expected. I've been really delighted at the response to this. We'll see where it goes, but it's still early days. I know it came out about a year ago, but for academic books, it takes a lot longer to build buzz than it does for more popular works. And so, yeah, so far I've just been really thrilled at people and their interest, and people take up different pieces of the project. And that's to be fair. I don't want it to be the last word. I want it to be the first word in a different conversation. And I look forward to people taking it in different ways and developing it in ways I don't anticipate. Do something new or different with it, or, talk to me about it. I'm especially interested in collaborations at different points. At this point in my life, I think part of the way I can help junior people is to collaborate with them in ways that benefit us both, but especially them. And so I'm really excited about that. It helped that I wrote this book after getting tenure, and now I have tenure, and it really helps that I'm not beholden to these senior people who are skeptical about the project as a whole. So thank you very much for opening this conversation. I don't have so much time. I think I have another 15 minutes or so because my partners told me that my dinner is cooling upstairs. But I'm happy to take some replies, and I'm also happy I'm slow about emails, but if you want to email me in English or Spanish, I'm happy to try and reply. Again, don't expect it too quickly, but you can find me if you Google my full name, you'll find my Williams College webpage, or I think you'll get there if you just Google Jason Storm. But anyway, I'm Jason Ananda Josephson Storm, and you can find my email. And if you don't have time today, please do so. Please feel free to email me. And again, I'm kind of slow about email. I may not get back to you quickly, but I will get back to you eventually.
Thanks a lot. So we can take just one question from the chat. This user, Osito, is asking this. For people less brilliant than the creator of this question, your posture will be that the deconstruction of postmodernism have given us tools and has limited us construction about new ideals. The critic of the total process and everything everything, all of this has opened a new phantom. I'm meaning that we are not limited in a reflection, like we said, we cannot think beyond capitalism. So a critic deconstructive but proposal about a new ideal, perdón, es que no puedo traducir esto, está redactado de manera más rara, pero sería en español una crítica deconstruista, pero sí propuesta para un nuevo ideal, de forma más simple que diría, ofrece su idea. O sea, that's what are you proposing? Thinking beyond capitalism, maybe?
Yeah. Yeah, see. Yeah, insofar as I've understood the question, I am trying to work past capitalism. Yes, exactly. And one of the things that is ironic, I don't know if how many people have read Mark Fisher's book, Capitalist Realism. He departs from a quote that's sometimes attributed to Fred Jameson and sometimes attributed to Slavoj Žižek, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. I think he presumes that there's no other responses to capitalism in the present moment. And I think he's actually wrong, that there are a lot of different counter-capitalist or post-capitalist projects just emerging, not at this exact moment, but also at this exact moment. And I don't mean a backward movement to Marxism, for example, more biography than you need. But, my parents were Marxists. That's all great. And I totally agree with the Marxist critique of capitalism. But just in practice, we need to find ourselves into an alternative post-capitalist future that doesn't succumb to the problems of vanguard communism or the old-fashioned Marxism of the older generation. If we could. I'm way more anti-capitalist than I'm anti-Marxist, but I'm pro-Marxist in certain ways, but just I don't think it's the end. Similarly, I am trying to push us past the horizon of contemporary capitalism. I don't have a unitary solution to that. In fact, the project that I'm working on right now is trying to think about utopian alternative politics to capitalism. Reading work on, this will sound old school to you all, but, refreshing myself with the Zapatistas and their importance in the 19, I loved, in the 90s or something like that. Or looking at science fiction that imagines alternatives to capitalism, Star Trek or the Banks culture novels or whatever. So I do think that we fundamentally need to push past capitalism, and I do think that part of the thrust of the book is an attempt to provide a theoretical alternative. Postmodernism, for all its association with Marxism, contributed to neoliberalism. It did not undercut capitalism. Derrida's notion of the exchangeability and continual free flowing of the sign couldn't have been a better theory for commodities of contemporary capitalist world order. And a lot of and Foucault's own complex connections to neoliberalism, and kind of libertarianism are now well known to scholars, etc. So we need to move past those. And part of doing this theoretical work is an attempt to push us into a new political order, but I don't have the answer. So this is a long-winded way of saying that's one of the things I'm working on now is thinking about that. I have an intermediate book around power, where what I'm doing next is theorizing power. At least that's the next big book. But after that, and I'm really doing it actually like this very semester, is leading some really talented students who are also looking for utopian alternatives to capitalism. But I haven't found what I need yet. And maybe I won't. Maybe this is for some other leader to take us to. But at least I think metamodernism and philosophy, as I've articulated it, can help. So maybe this is for you all, and some of you in your collective, to help use this to push us into a new, better post-capitalist world.
Wise words. Thanks a lot, Professor. We are keeping contact, I hope.
Yes, of course.
So goodbye. This is the end.
Yeah, thank you very much. And please, if you have further questions or comments, do email me. You can also find me, I should say, on Twitter. I don't love Twitter, but it's where I do announce new things that I'm doing. If you want to, it's too capitalist for me, but if you do want to find new things that I'm talking about or what have you, I don't put a lot of personal stuff on there, but you can find me at Twitter under ghost_image_ on Twitter, and find me there as well. And thank you for giving me your time. I hope I didn't speak too quickly too often. And please take care and be well. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bastante complicado. Déjenme aquí, quito el streaming. Sí, o sea, y es padre, o sea, la verdad es que estaba interesado en lo que estaba escuchando, pero pues son ideas muy alargadas. Como que estaba traduciendo, pero como que no hallaba el meollo del asunto hasta como 3 minutos después, ¿no? Entonces como estoy interpretando muchas palabras, pero sí es complicado. Entonces una disculpa a los que me escucharon. Espero que les haya servido de algo. No les estoy ayudando, pero también como retroalimentación, también me gustaría que me hablaran sobre lo que les pareció, porque me pareció muy interesante, pero como retroalimentación, ¿qué les pareció la interpretación? Es la primera vez que interpreto de manera simultánea. Y para los que no sepan, soy intérprete consecutivo, ¿no? Pero adelante.
Y Mix, o sea, este Mix se le escucha como teclea.
Sí.
Pero bueno, Cheers, hiciste una maravillosa traducción para los pendejos que no sabemos inglés. Muchas gracias.
Sí, espero. Hubo muchas ideas que dije, ya una vez que la termino dije, uy, no, ya la cagué, pero espero que las ideas que sí interpreté bien les haya servido.
Imagine not speaking English.
Sí, aquí andamos para ayudarles. Me hubiera gustado que hubiera sido consecutiva, ¿no? Pero sí quita más tiempo.
Tenemos que despedir del stream que está por acabar.
¿Pasamos al stream?
No, que se está por acabar, que se despida.
Estamos en stream, si quiere que alguien despida.
Bueno, gracias a todos, la comunidad monóvica, de ver el canal de YouTube. Entren al canal, entren a la comunidad de Discord. Like y suscríbanse. Y gracias a todos por estar.
Tú no, dice que los cito, no mentiras. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias por estarnos escuchando en el streaming de hoy. Tuvimos la gran oportunidad de hablar con este filósofo con nuevas propuestas. Y no, yo no soy la persona indicada, pero muchas gracias.